Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for showing up tonight. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 Facebook group. And I'm here tonight with David Blowbaum, who is the founder and CEO of Summit Prep. It's a test prep company that we've been partnering with for the past 6 months. And tonight, David's going to talk about the SAT, ACT, PSAT, and all the changes that have been happening and that parents and students should be aware of. I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to spotlight David and myself so it's easier to see us or listen, or if, and we're not just a small square in a sea of other squares. The other thing I will say is if you are open to it, we love to actually have people's on video and see their face, because this is actually a Zoom meeting. It's not a Zoom webinar, so it's just nice to see people's faces and get to know people. So if you want to put yourself on video, I see a few people already doing that. That would be really nice. I appreciate it. And the last thing is, always love to know where people are watching from. Put in the chat where you're from, what year your student is in high school, if your student has taken any of the tests, if they've done any test prep. Just it would be helpful to get a little understanding of who is watching tonight. And the last thing is, please put your questions in the chat. Actually, David and I talked earlier today, and he wants to answer as many questions as possible. He actually told me I should interrupt him when some good questions come through so that we can answer the questions as you share them. So I'm going to monitor the questions as David goes through and shares all of his extensive knowledge. And I think it will be a really informative and helpful evening tonight. Oh, and one last piece of housekeeping. This is recorded, and you will get a link to the recording in an email tomorrow. So with that, David, let's get started.
Awesome. All right, so I'm going to share my screen. All right, perfect. So thanks for the introduction, Debbie, and it's our pleasure to partner with you guys. I'm David Blowbaum. I'm one of the co-owners, and I'm the managing partner or CEO of Summit Prep. And it's my pleasure to talk about some of the changes that have been coming to the SAT and ACT. And we're going to focus on the changes to the digital format. So we'll jump in and start with the digital SAT. So there were a lot of changes. The SAT changed last March, so March of 2024. There were tons of changes. I'm only going to go through the largest changes that really you need to be aware of. So the first major change is that the SAT is now adaptive, and it's section adaptive. So what that means is that all students will take the first verbal section. It'll be the same for all of them. It'll have easy, medium, and hard questions on that verbal section. Now, if they do well on that, they're going to get a hard verbal that just has medium and hard difficulty questions. If they don't do as well, they'll get an easy verbal that just has easy and medium questions on it, no hard at all. Next section is the math. Again, they all get the same math section. And again, if they do better, they get the hard math. Not as well, they get the easy math. We're going to actually come back to some of this later on. So just keep it in your minds that you could go the hard route or the easy route. Let's say you did pretty well on the verbal, but you just missed the hard module by just one question. And then you get all the easy questions here right. And again, just barely miss the hard module, get all the easy questions here right. Then you've still capped your score at like a 1250 because the student never got the opportunity to take those hard they never even saw the hard questions. So the SAT is not going to give them credit for essentially getting the hard questions right because they never even got to them.
I was going to ask David, so basically that first section on both the verbal and math, where it's this combination of easy, medium, and hard questions, kind of in some ways determines the best you can do on that test. Because if you go and the lower route, and as you said, even if you do really well on the easy verbal, you've kind of maxed out what you could potentially get.
You're exactly right. So and I love answering questions. The downside is I also love answering questions. So then we might go long, but it's important for some students to know who are like really close to the cutoff, where they're like just one or two questions shy of getting into the hard. They're likely going to see a 100-point drop. Whereas if they were to get maybe one or two more questions right and they get into hard, even if they get most of the hard wrong, they actually still usually end up with a higher score.
Mm.
So there is kind of like this donut in the middle where it's where if you're between like a if you miss that cutoff, you might end up with like an 1100 otherwise, as opposed to if you get into the hard, you might end up with a 1300. So
So David, somebody's asking, like, if you're the student, do you know that this is happening? I mean, you know the concept, but as it's happening, like, do you know, oh gosh, I've kind of gotten the easy route instead of like going to the hard route?
you're totally going to know. Yeah. I mean, if
Uh,
you've taken the test before and seen both the hard and the easy, it's going to be very obvious to you that, oh, I got the easy or I got the hard. Now, I mean, most of the students who are getting the easy modules, they've never even seen the hard modules, right, in practice, because they've never done well enough to get the hard modules. But for those students who they might vacillate between just getting enough or not getting enough and get slotted in, they're immediately going to know.
so somebody else is saying this seems kind of bad for a student who kind of needs to warm up. You know what I mean? Like somebody who, maybe just isn't like, just doesn't feel strong enough out of the gate.
Yes, there's trade-offs to everything, right? So, definitely it's unfair in some ways, right? That like you make, maybe two bad guesses or that section just doesn't line up with your knowledge on math as well. Maybe it asks more questions on quadratics, not as many as usual on exponents. And, then you get slotted into the easy math. The flip side of it is it's so much better for students who really aren't the top scoring students because the flip side, which we'll kind of touch on as well, is on the ACT. Even if the weakest students, they're going to see the hardest questions on the ACT. The ACT doesn't adapt. That is very deflating to a student's confidence to have half the math section that they just can't solve. It's almost it makes the SAT feel a lot better that they're not getting these questions that they have no idea how to solve and that they're just running out of time on because the questions are too hard. So yes, to that point, um, unfair to some students, but it also has some benefits in some ways too. So yeah, and this is the only way they can make the test shorter.
Mm,
And so for students, you give them that option, and they're probably going to pick a shorter test. So
hmm.
yeah. So that's the section adaptive. Um, then we get to more time per question. Now, if you get any marketing material from the College Board about the SAT, they typically highlight this, more time per question, etc. It doesn't matter. So all things being equal, that would be great, except all things are not equal. They added in more words and made those questions harder, especially on the hard modules. So actually, this new SAT, if you're getting the hard modules, it's actually harder to complete in the time than it was on the old SAT. So it's still easier than the ACT to complete in time, but it's more difficult than before. So don't ignore that when they say more time per question. Vocabulary is back. So it took a 8-year hiatus between 2016 and 2024 when they weren't really testing vocabulary, but now it is back. So the average student can increase their score by about 50 points on the verbal just by studying a lot of vocabulary words. When I mean a lot of vocabulary words, I mean that average student would probably have to study vocab 10 to 20 hours to really memorize all the words. But to go up 50 points is very significant. So that's another thing to keep in mind. This next change is not good. There's a lot more volatility in the scores on this new SAT. The reason for that is the old SAT was 154 questions. So 154 questions made up your score out of 1600. Now it's 90 questions. the test is 98 questions, but 8 of those are experimental questions. So your score just comes from 90 questions. So that's almost 50% more weight to each question. And so with 50% more weight to each question, it makes a good day with a few good guesses a really good day. It makes a bad day with a few
Mm.
bad guesses a really bad day. So you're going to see more you do see more fluctuations in student scores. So if they do well and then the next time they don't do as well, honestly, it's pretty likely you can just chalk that up to the curve or just the luck of the draw on that day, unfortunately. And then the last big change, which is by far the biggest change that students need to pay attention to, is Desmos. So what is Desmos? Desmos is the SAT calculator that now all students have access to. So when it was a paper test, students, could bring in a calculator. Hopefully they were bringing in a graphing calculator. But when you think about it, that was pretty unfair that some students don't have a calculator, some students have a scientific calculator, some students have a graphing calculator. Different tools for the same test doesn't seem very standardized. So the SAT said, you know what? We're going to give everyone access to an insanely powerful calculator, right? So that's the Desmos calculator. Um, a lot of students aren't even aware, though, that they get access to this on. This is exactly what it looks like for students. They click on that calculator icon, which doesn't look very exciting, but it's an amazing tool. Doesn't look very exciting, but ironically, by trying to solve that lack of standardization, they've actually created an even worse lack of standardization in the sense that the calculator is honestly too powerful. So they should weaken it because if you really know all, and I hate this word tips and tricks because I want students to just be going up by learning the math and the grammar and that's where the vast majority of a score increase comes from. But unfortunately, there are tips and tricks to the Desmos calculator because it is so complex and it does have so much depth. So I'm going to give a plug for we have an amazing Desmos class. I think it's the best Desmos class in the country. But I am only
And
giving that.
very reasonable, like for what it is.
I appreciate that. Yeah. And so we put a lot of time into it. I only bring that up because if it's not with us, please have your kids master Desmos. There are a lot of schools where they never use Desmos at all in the math classes. So really the kids are missing out on the best tool for the SAT math section. So even if it's not a class with us, go on YouTube. There are amazing YouTube videos on how to master Desmos. It really behooves every student to put the time in. Okay, so those are the changes to the SAT. So now we'll get to the digital ACT. So the first thing to understand about the ACT right now is there's two formats. You can take it in the digital format, you can take it in the paper format. Very annoyingly, they made the digital test, they rolled a new ACT out for the digital test. That rollout for the paper format doesn't happen until September. So right now, digital, new ACT, what they're calling the enhanced ACT, paper is the old ACT that hasn't changed for 30 years. All right. Uh, don't take the digital ACT. So, and the reason why you don't want to take the digital ACT is there's only one practice test for that digital test that the ACT has put out. That is not enough practice to really feel comfortable with it and really understand what's going to happen on test day then. So I would say do not take the digital ACT. There is one exception though. Another reason why beyond lack of practice that you don't want to take the digital version is that they took the paper ACT and they just slapped it into a digital form. It wasn't created as a digital test. Like the SAT was created to be a digital test. It works perfectly as a digital test. The ACT does not. In the comments, can anyone, and this is again just from the ACT, this is from the one practice test they put out. Can anyone tell me an issue with this setup from this question? You can put it in the chat. And maybe I'm just not seeing a response. Yes, Jennifer, exactly. Where is table 2? Perfect. So Um, and this is according to ACT's own research. One of the primary determinants of your score on the ACT science section is if you know where to look. They put eye tracking goggles on students' eyes while they were taking the test to do the eye tracking. And the students who look in the correct places tend to get the questions right. So looking in the right place is so important. Well, this is number one. It's literally item one on the practice test, and it says based on table two. You have to scroll down to get to table two.
Ah,
Well, some of these questions will say based on table one and figure three. So then you're scrolling up and down and up and down and up and down to look between table one and figure three. It's a total mess. This test was not designed to be a digital test. It's a mess. Okay, so we know don't take the digital format. The exception, though, is that the new ACT, the composite score for the new ACT is just based on your English, your math, and your reading sections. They average those three scores together, and that's how you get your composite. This old ACT, which is the current ACT in the paper format, that composite score is your English, your math, your reading, and your science averaged together to get your composite score. So the one exception when you might actually want to take the digital ACT right now in June or July is if your science score is just disproportionately low. Like if you have like a 30 on English, math, and reading, and your science is a 22, and you just basically know you're not going to be able to, you just have a mental block for the science, and it's bringing your whole composite score down by 2 points. Okay, fine. Maybe take the digital ACT that drops the science score from your composite. Your composite score might actually just go up just by getting rid of the science. Um, the changes to the ACT, though, overall, and I'll explain those generally as well, because again, the paper format will become the new ACT starting in September. So starting in September, the digital and paper, the new test. So on that new test, the science section is optional, but not really optional. So yes, the ACT has made it optional to take, and you can pay an extra $4 to take that science section. I would personally not think of it as being optional because there are some schools that recommend or require it. So the one that comes to mind, and what comes to mind when I say that is the worst offender, would be Boston University. So Boston University is test optional. Makes no sense, though, that if you submit an ACT score, they say, if you submit an ACT score, we require you to send the science section. So it's like, all right, so you give me the option to send 0 ACT section scores, or I have to send all of my section ACT scores. It really doesn't make sense. But anyway, you get the idea. There are schools that recommend or require the science section. So students really should just take it with science, even when the test changes. This is not a good change, wild curves. So the SAT, by becoming significantly shorter, has a lot more volatility in its curves and its scales and scores. Same thing for the ACT. The ACT is going from 215 questions to 108 questions. So, what that looks like, let's look at the old ACT. Now let's just say that the student gets 5 questions wrong in each section. Okay, so 5 questions wrong in English, 35. 5 questions wrong in math, 35. 5 questions wrong in reading gets them a 32. 5 questions wrong in the science gets them a 32. So 35, 35, 32, 32. All right, now let's look at the new ACT, the practice test that the ACT has put out. 5 wrong in English, 29 instead of a 35. 5 wrong in math, 32. 5 wrong in reading, 28. 5 wrong in science, 31. So the questions have massively more weight to them. So again, there's a lot more volatility in scores. And it's not theoretical either. The ACT, I don't know why they published this, but it's great. I wish the SAT was this transparent. The ACT has already published that on their enhanced test, that's the new test, they have more error in their measurement. So on average, they have about 30% more error to their curves. So if you have a test with a high degree of reliability, which is the current ACT and was the old SAT, then as you acquire knowledge and skill, your scores are not going to always perfectly reflect your knowledge and skill because you can have a good day, bad day, and there's error in the curves. But when you have a test with low reliability, like the ACT is turning into and like the SAT already is, you have significantly more swings in score. So even as your acquired knowledge and skills going up, you could, and I mean, you could go from 25 to 29 to down to 27, up to 31, down to 30. This is not unrealistic for what you could literally see as results. So the overall trend line is up, and that's what students are going to need to pay attention to more than before. Is my overall trend line up? And then just keep taking the test. The ACT is also giving students more time per question. This is actually legitimate, though, that they're giving students more time per question because they really haven't made the questions harder. So students are finding already from those who have taken the digital ACT in the new format that they're not as pressed for time. And anyone will tell you one of the hardest things about the ACT is timing. So it is becoming a more comfortable exam for more students to take. All right, but which tests should students take then? Students really don't like it when I tell them this, but you really have to take a full practice test of each. I mean, there are some combined tests that will say, hey, it's a 3-hour exam, and from that one 3-hour exam, we'll tell you which test is better. I would not trust those at all. And typically, a lot of time and money is going to be spent on prep or, going in one direction or another. I would try and get it right as you can from the beginning, which is take a full test of each. For current juniors, you can take the current ACT in the paper format. Again, that test, the ACT hasn't changed for 30 years. You don't need to take, you can still take that paper format of the current ACT in June and July. But for current sophomores, I wouldn't take one of the current ACTs. I'd take one of the new ACTs. ACT has put out 4 practice tests for that new exam. Take those with a grain of salt because they're just chopped up old exams put into the new format, but they're better than nothing. All right. You take those full practice tests, compare your scores, not your feelings on them, because students really prefer the feel of the SAT. And for that, I just want to point out, actually, I guess I'll ask another question. Jennifer nailed it so well that I'll ask another question to the group. Why do you think people, especially about like 50% of students, really prefer the feel of the SAT?
Maybe they just feel they can get through it. They feel like, that if you can answer most of the questions, you probably feel like you've done a good job.
So 100% that, 100% that. And also, they're like, for those students who are scoring under a 1200, they'll come out and they'll say, oh my gosh, compared to that ACT, the SAT just felt so much easier. It was objectively an easier exam. They never saw the hard questions. So absolutely, the SAT is going to feel easier. To your point, Debbie, they got a chance to finish the test, but also they didn't see the hard questions a lot of times. And so on the ACT, they're going to see those hardest questions and very often get them wrong. But students need to understand once they're doing prep and increasing their score, eventually they're going to get to the hard sections, or hopefully they get to the hard sections. And then it's not going to feel so easy anymore. So absolutely look up the official concordance tables, compare your scores on both, go based on the scores, not the feelings. Also, I just like to point out, I mean, it used to be the case you really didn't want to take the test, either the SAT or the ACT more than 3 times. Now students are taking the test more because in the Common App, so this is actually exactly what it looks like in the Common App. For the vast majority of schools, all they see is your self-reported scores initially in the Common App. So you just put in your highest verbal ever, your highest math ever. There are some recruited athletes that we work with who have to hit certain scores. Some of these recruited athletes are taking the test 5, 6. I mean, we've even had a recruited athlete take it 7 times. That's school is still just seeing their highest ever verbal, highest ever math. The ACT, you can even delete ACT scores at any time. It's very easy. It's just an email to the ACT. So you can also take the test multiple times as well, which is particularly important with greater volatility in scores.
David, somebody asked,
Mhm.
do the colleges know if a student is taking the digital ACT versus the paper one?
Good question. They do not. Yeah. Um, I mean, they will know when you take like when you go to apply, they will know at the time of if it was a new ACT. So like right now, if you were to submit your scores, the only way you would be able to submit a new ACT score would be by taking the digital. But come when you're actually applying, um, there won't be any difference at that point between digital or paper because there will just be new ACT versus old ACT, if that makes sense. They won't know if that score came. I suppose they could look up the dates, like look up, okay, this is a new ACT from this date, but they're not going to do that. The vast majority of schools as well, they don't care if they're super scoring between the new ACT or the current ACT. There are some exceptions to that, but 99% of the time, it doesn't matter. They're just looking at your super score or your highest composite. It
So
is a really good question.
there's somebody's also asking, why would you want to delete ACT scores from your account?
Very good question. So the reason I mention it is more so just for peace of mind. Because when students go in and take a test, they're nervous. And in their minds, a lot of times they're telling themselves, my whole future rides on these results, right? And so if they know that not only do they not need to report those scores to colleges, but they can literally delete them, then they can go in mentally taking the real test as a practice test. So that's just psychologically better for them because it's not so stressful, but also typically their performance improves as well. So functionally, when would you actually delete your ACT score? Vanishingly, few cases. The most prominent though would be if a student is applying to Georgetown. So Georgetown requires you to send all of your scores. There's the loophole that if you've taken the ACT, let's say well, actually, I mean, the student, actually, the recruited athlete who I'm thinking of, who did take it 7 times, she just deleted 5 of her past ACTs before she applied to Georgetown then. So then when Georgetown says you have to send in all of your scores, she was actually sending in all of her scores because you cannot send a deleted score. Even if you asked ACT, hey, can you delete can you send that December ACT score that I deleted? No. So when Georgetown says you send all your scores, she literally is sending all of her scores. So functionally, vanishingly small percentage of students will ever delete their scores. But, in practice, it's good to, know that that's an option just to take the pressure off of test day. But, and then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I would just be remiss if I didn't put the tests in the context of the scores and what we're actually doing with the scores. So, generally speaking, the more selective, the more test scores matter. And I'm not even saying more selective the school, but which I'll get into. So, for instance, one really good place to look for how selective is a school or how much do they actually value test scores is to look at a common data set. So you can just Google, any school, Duke common data set and look at section C9. It'll show what percent of students submitted test scores. This is actually pretty outdated. Duke hasn't updated it since like 2022. I just like that it's a really high number. Like this is a ridiculously high number for a test optional school that 93% of their 93% of the students who enrolled there submitted test scores. Of course, Duke is very selective. And then I brought up University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign because this is a pretty high percentage overall. This is the overall campus. 59% of enrolled students submitted test scores. But when you drill down into their different schools, right, school of social work, 28% of enrolled students submitted test scores. It's test optional to get into their school of social work. But you look at their school of engineering, 81% submitted test scores. So again, it's not just how selective a school is, like the overall institution, it's also how selective the major is. How do we know that as well? I mean, test blind Berkeley, they're not test blind, they're SAT, ACT blind. UC Berkeley is too selective to not use standardized test scores. They use AP and IB exam scores. And then we see that this is bearing out in practice as well. This was, so we see in the trend in score supporting over time. So in this last admission cycle, according to the Common App, there was a 1% drop in applicants who use or in Common App users who did not report a score. There was an 11% rise in the number that did report a test score. So more students are submitting. But it's
Which
not just
actually,
about
David, that actually corresponds to, if you know all the data, which I'm sure you do of the Common App, there's been an increase in the number of students applying to selective schools. So if the scores are more important at selective schools, it makes sense that there's a higher percentage of students submitting scores.
totally fair. Yeah. 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 And to that point as well, that this is just overall a Common App users. Like I'm like if you broke it down by which the Common App didn't publish it, but if you were to break it down by those applying to highly selective schools, I bet it's basically everyone, right? Um, and they did break it out by is the user first generation or not first generation, and it was non-first gen, which tends to correspond somewhat to socioeconomic status. It was massively higher as well. So different groups within those applying submit at different rates. But yeah, so it's not just about getting into college either. It's also about money. So test scores can help students not just get into college, but afford college. So I like to just look, longitudinally. So like this bottom left is state grants. So it used to be in 1980, really there were no state grants for merit aid. Now we see that now actually a pretty decent percentage of all state grants are from merit aid based on GPA and or test scores. It really doesn't matter though what state you're in. So, I mean, some of these states they're giving zero financial aid based on for state grants based on financial aid. But then a lot of them they don't give any merit aid at all based on GPA and test score. So it really matters what state you're in. I like to highlight Bright Future scholarships because they're it's pretty incredible that you hit a 3.0 and a 24 on your ACT, 75% free in-state tuition. You hit a 3.5 and a 29 on your ACT, 100% free in-state tuition. So again, not just about getting in, but also affording it. So I'm happy to answer any and all, though all with a caveat until I lose my voice. But here's our contact information if you have more questions beyond this this webinar, and I'm always happy to answer questions. So I guess.
Yep, David, we've got definitely some questions. I'm just going to scroll back. Are
Cool.
you ready? So one thing you didn't talk about is students that need accommodations. Has
Yeah.
anything changed for them, or are all the changes you talked about, does it apply for students getting accommodations?
Uh, it, Nothing change. Good question. Nothing changes as far as accommodations go. Yeah. So if you got accommodations before, you're going to get accommodations now. I guess the one change would be some students have an accommodation where they get the accommodation that they can take paper tests. So now, there is actually an accommodation for getting to take the SAT on paper, for instance, but not really relevant for the vast majority of students.
Somebody gave the example that their son had gotten a 1220 on the first SAT, got a 1320 on the second SAT. They're aiming for a 1400. I mean, I know that's all the information you have, but what's your recommendation about how they should study? Meaning, should they focus in on maybe studying the one section, or should they try and like improve themselves across the entire test?
Great question. Can you say those numbers again?
They started at 1220, got increased to 1320, and want to hit 1400.
Okay. I would love to know what the student section scores were. So by and large, verbal is a lot stickier of a score. It's a lot harder to improve the verbal. So, I mean, you can target the grammar, you can target the vocabulary, you can target the questions that are testing transition words. Beyond that, it gets pretty hard to increase a student's score because the it's actually reading questions beyond that, not just grammar and rhetorical skills. Those are easier to improve. To really improve a student's reading ability is harder. The math is significantly, it's not that it's easy to improve, but it's much easier to improve because more or less you teach the student the content, they should theoretically get it right on test day. So, I mean, I guess without knowing those section scores, I would say just keep studying both. And unless you've maxed out one. So like let's say with that 1320, the student has I don't know, like let's say a 720 in one section and a 600 in the other. Well, don't stop worrying about the 720 section, right? Just focus on the 600 section, more or less. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but
Yeah. And what about, since you talked that it's harder to increase the verbal section, what is there a suggested way that you have for studying vocabulary?
so, I mean, we have our own vocabulary list, which I think is a very good vocabulary list. We don't sell it, um, to the public. Anyone who is doing prep with us, certainly we give access to that. But actually, I haven't looked at other vocabulary lists, but I would say there's no harm in learning vocabulary. Um, the other vocabulary books or lists or Quizlet has some good vocabulary lists on it. I would just study as much on those as I can.
Somebody was asking, maybe you can talk also a little bit more about the practice tests for the SAT and ACT. Is the practice SAT adaptive? So is it truly like, a mirror of what they're going to get on test day, and how many are available?
Very good question. So yes, they are far superior to the practice ACT tests that are currently out. Um, I actually like the ACT better, to be honest. So like I'm not throwing shade at the ACT. So the SAT, yes, you students have to download the Blue Book app. That's a good app to have on your computer anyway, because you're going to take the PSAT through it. If you're taking AP exams, you take the AP exams through it. If you're taking a digital AP exam, and you're going to take the SAT through it. So you download the digital, the Blue Book app onto your device, and then there are 7 practice tests. Now, some of those practice tests, I kind of disagree with the scales a little bit. If you want what is, in my opinion, the most uh, accurate practice test of the 7 that are out, it's actually number 7, lucky number 7. So if your student takes lucky number 7 of those Blue Book practice tests, I would say that's the most accurate prediction of what they'll probably get on test day. So, and then the ACT, I mean, there are a lot of released ACT tests. Those are actually pretty easy to come by, those paper versions. You can Google, I can actually try and find it, practice ACT, online. There's multiple different links, but you can find the one practice ACT that is online, available to the public. Then there's the ACT's Red Book that has 4 practice tests in it, but number 1 is a repeat of the one that's online. But that Red Book, again, those are on paper, but at least you get 4 of the new ACT in that Red Book.
So is it worth, I mean, people might be seeing that there are companies that make, like SAT test uh, uh, sample tests, or digital versions, but they're not officially, from the College Board. Are they still worth using?
So I would say never for the initial mock tests. I would never touch them for the initial mock test because the College Board and the ACT spend millions of dollars developing every single one of their tests. These tests are extremely expensive to make because they're very high quality tests. Um, and so if you take a third party test, there's a 0% chance that as much money and time and research went into calibrating that exam, making the questions as high quality, making the scoring as accurate. So I wouldn't touch them for mock tests. Now, for a lot of students, 7 official practice tests for the SAT is not going to be enough practice tests.
Right.
So then you have to dip into third-party tests. We've taken the tests, I think, of every single digital SAT platform out there. So Summit Prep personally works with 2 third-party providers for SATs, for digital SATs. Those are the highest quality on the market for third party. They're very good. They are not as good as the real tests. But after you've gone through the 7 real tests, you have to work with something. So it's a long way of saying don't use them for mock tests. Eventually, you might have to use them, but they're a plan B.
So actually, though, are they plan B or are they kind of like a mix? Meaning, like, do you want to like kind of save some of those real College Board tests and not use them all up, all at once, kind of,
That is an astute question because that's exactly what we do.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, I mean, if the student has one more chance at the SAT, yeah, we're just going to use, in like 7 weeks leading up to it, we're just going to use the 7 official exams. But if we have a student who is starting in 1100, is trying to get to a 1400, it's going to take a long time. I mean, a long time and a lot of work, definitely more than 7 practice tests. So we're going to do, that official baseline and then probably do 4 of the third party tests, do another
Mm-hmm.
official digital College Board one, then another 4 third party. So to
Mm-hmm.
your point, yes, so that we get these check-ins with much more accurate scoring and the exact quality that we're looking for.
Okay. Somebody's asking about a student who might take the 2 different versions of the ACTs, one that has the science and one that might not. How are the colleges going to compare these 2 composites that were made up of different number of sections?
So, I mean, I think that the colleges will work with what they have. And so the ACT has put out research that the predictive capacity of their English, math, reading, science composite is 99% the same as their English, math, and reading composite. Now, I don't know. I would be inclined to not believe that, but in the same data dump of research, they published research that their new ACT is less reliable. So it's like they're
They're,
publishing
they're
stuff that,
really kind of like sharing too much.
yeah. So it's like,
I'm kind of
if
wondering why they made all these changes.
yeah, and so it's like, if they're going to share information that makes them look bad, I almost kind of like that almost lends credibility to the fact that, yeah, and they will say in, close door meetings that their science section really gave basically no predictive validity or no additional predictive capacity beyond the English, math, and reading scores. So I'm actually inclined to believe them on that, and in which case colleges really shouldn't be using the science section. What should all colleges really do? Not use the science and just compare students' English, math, and reading scores. So I do think that you're going to have a lot of. I think the vast majority of schools are honestly not even going to put as much thinking into this as we are. To be honest, I think they're going to say an ACT composite score is an ACT composite score.
Hmm.
We're just going to compare their ACT composite scores, whatever ACT composite score we get. I think that's going to be how it is. But for those highly selective institutions, they're much more discerning in what they're expecting from applicants. And so I would take an optional science score as a mandatory science score,
Hmm.
and at least for now. So.
Okay, so somebody is asking, they have a sophomore, and their student kind of got comparable scores on the ACT and SAT on practice versions, and wondering with like what you've kind of like discussed tonight and the pros and cons of each test, like, what do you think that they should be focusing on for junior year? So they're kind of like even or equal, in their performance on both tests, but knowing what you know about, these changes to the 2 tests, which do you think that they should lean towards?
So I hate to say again, I'd love more context, but I would love more context. And the reason I mention that is because again, the split in section scores is really, really important. So if the student had a significantly lower verbal and a significantly higher math on the SAT, SAT is going to be an uphill battle because we can't get most of our increase from the math. Whereas, if it's reversed and a very high verbal and a lower math, hey, that's a lot easier path on the SAT. ACT, generally, it's a more preppable test because the SAT, it was designed in the 1920s to be an IQ test. Now it has become more of an achievement test. Um, it has really followed the ACT in being an achievement test, but it still retains some of its aptitude test roots. So the ACT is much more, hey, did you learn this in school? Cool. Just show us on test day, right? The SAT is, hey, did you learn this in school? Okay, cool. Can you apply this in a new way that you've never seen? So it tries to be trickier. So all things being equal, I think I would choose the ACT because it is just a more straightforward test. I would want more information though, because I'm not very enthused about the changes to the ACT and the volatility. So I hope,
So,
yeah,
but this is actually a good example. So if your student has taken any sample tests or even an actual test, and you're kind of trying to figure out what to do next, they can follow up
yeah,
with
perfect.
you and have these conversations to kind of break apart the subsections and really better understand what a strategy could be to help improve the score for the next time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so just because you showed it, David, maybe you can explain. So a few people aren't familiar with Bright Futures. Do you want to
Mhm.
just give a little bit more explanation of what it is?
Yes. So I'm not an expert on it. I will say, let me point people to a great resource for it. Well, Debbie is a great resource for it, so she's the best resource for it. But if just to look up merit, I don't know, Debbie, if you've seen this website,
Mm-hmm.
meritaidgrids.com. I like it. It just has just a bunch of, I don't know, maybe all of like the automatic merit aids that you can get across all the states. But in any event, that's where I go to look these things up. But as I understand it, I'm in New Jersey, so I'm not in Florida. But as I understand it, in Florida, test prep is a much bigger thing because basically everyone should do test prep in Florida. Because if you can get to, I think it's that 25, let me just go back to the
So
slide,
maybe what people
24.
don't understand. So Bright Futures is the scholarship for Florida state residents. So that's why, and that's a very good point, David, for anybody who is a Florida state resident, they really should try and get to that level because it's going to make a huge financial difference. So if you
Yeah.
don't live in Florida, unfortunately, this scholarship doesn't apply to you.
Yeah, and like to that point, it changes everything about, test prep because in New Jersey, usually you're only going to use a test score if the test score is pretty high if you're, applying to a school in the Northeast. If you're applying to a school in the South, yeah, there's a much higher likelihood that you need a test score. That's a broad generalization, but in Florida, it changes everything because it's not just about getting in, it's really about affording it. So basically everyone should do test prep because even if you were to spend a crazy amount on test prep, let's say $20,000, right? You're still probably going to come out ahead. If you could turn like a 17 into a 24, you're still probably going to come out ahead financially. So it makes things that would be insane in other states make sense because you really want to hit these cutoffs in Florida and in
Eh,
some other states too.
Well, I was going to say another big state is Georgia has the Hope Scholarship.
Yeah.
So these are state scholarships, which are very, very beneficial to the in-state residents.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Um, let's see. Oh, so this is a parent who has a freshman, and they're wondering, in preparation for all of this, is there one important subject or one subject that's really important for their freshman to really start to get good at?
I love this question. All right. Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
ooh.
Yes. Just First of all, forget about the SAT and ACT, but read. Just read all the time. If you can become an avid reader, if your child, which is a hard task, right? I mean, it was probably a hard task before TikTok. It's an even harder task now,
Right.
right? So, but if you can help your child cultivate a love of reading, they're going to crush these verbal sections on the SAT and the ACT. Reading is the most helpful skill for life because it impacts basically all of your other subjects in school. Because if you're a good reader, you're going to read your biology textbook faster. You're going to understand your biology textbook more. I mean, there are students on the math section who are very good at math and they misunderstand even the word problems, right? So just read a ton. That will be the best thing that your child can do as a freshman to set themselves up for success later.
Okay, that's a really good advice. There's a question here, another interesting one about the PSAT, and somebody's wondering if it's worth it anymore. That the PSAT that is offering, if there are fewer schools really offering national merit scholarships based on your PSAT score, is it worth focusing on to do well, really well at?
In about 99% of circumstances, no. And quite honestly, it never was. I mean, you will have, I mean, I hate to say it, but some friends of mine even market for PSAT tutoring, right? But I that has never made sense to be honest, because even if you were to do the prep to get a National Merit Scholarship, most families will spend more on the prep than they would get from the National Merit Scholarship. National Merit Scholarship, you have to be in the 90, you have to be in the top 1% of your state, which also varies a lot, right? I mean, if you live in Louisiana, it's a lot easier to be in the top 1%. The score threshold is a lot lower. New Jersey, Connecticut, to be in the top 1% on those, you almost need a perfect score on your PSAT. So one, it'll vary a little bit by state, but you do need to be in the 1 percentile, top 1% of your state on that test. But even if you were to get the National Merit Scholarship, it's not much money, doesn't really help your chances. Um, the but if you can get it with no prep, go for it. The biggest reason you would want to really hit that is not actually college admissions, but if a parent works in finance or consulting, they should really check with their firm to see if their firm gives any automatic benefits. So there are some that will do full rides for any of their employees' kids who get the National Merit Scholarship. So then, okay, yeah, now it makes sense to prep for it, right? If you can get into the top 1%. But generally, no, I wouldn't worry about the PSAT scores. I would just, when the time comes, which is typically after sophomore year, the vast majority of our families, they start with us in June after sophomore year. I'd worry about, is the SAT or ACT better? Okay, let's figure that out. Let's start prep on it. You might want to start earlier than June after sophomore year, if one of two conditions is met or if both are met. Um, Recruited athletes. Some sports have a highly accelerated timeline, so then you might want to start earlier. Or if you just know you're starting, very much lower than your eventual score goal, yeah, you might want to start earlier than average as well.
Okay, someone's asking, since a lot of schools have gone test optional, when they go back to everyone submitting the test scores, what kind of swing can we expect to see? I guess they're talking about like the kind of the distribution of test scores that schools report.
So I keep being proven wrong by schools that are going back to test required because I see no benefit to them at all, except that they're, I think, just honest if they go back to test required. So when you stay test optional, they get a lot more applicants. When they get more applicants, their admit rate goes down because they still accept the same number of students. So, accepting 100 students out of 10,000 versus accepting 100 students out of 20,000, you've cut your admit rate in half, right? When Colgate went test optional, it saw its number of applicants more than doubled that year. So their admit rate literally fell in half. And so a lot of parents look at admit rate to try and figure out how good is this school. that's a proxy for quality in the minds, understandably, in the minds of a lot of families. And so colleges know this. They know that parents are looking at admit rates, and so they want to get the most number of applicants. So it's almost, shooting themselves in the foot to go back to test required because some schools that have gone back to test required have seen a drop in their number of applicants, and then their admit rate goes up. So I have been shocked that schools have gone back to test required. Um, I think the trend will actually be of more and more schools staying test optional, but behind the scenes being more and more test preferred. And it seems like that's already happening. So, but to the point of the question, if schools go back to test required, then yes, absolutely, the score ranges are then actually accurate. Because when you have a school like Pepperdine, it's like, it's a pretty good school, but only 21% of students or around there submitted test scores. So then when they give you a 50 percentile range for Pepperdine, that's not a 50 percentile range for Pepperdine. That's a 50 percentile range of the 20% that actually submitted test scores. So it's a totally irrelevant range. It gives you actually like no information about the school generally. So if Pepperdine were to go back to test required, it's, middle 50 percentile scores would just, drop off the map, basically. So yes, scores would come down at the vast majority of schools if they went back to test required.
Okay. Somebody is asking maybe if you could just kind of review again what you said about the science section not being included in the ACT composite. Their daughter took the digital ACT this April and her composite score included the science section. So
Your super score, actually, your super score composite doesn't even include it. No, so on the new ACT, the science score is not included in the composite. It's just the average of English, math, and reading. And also to that point, the super score composite also will not include the science on the new ACT. And actually, for all students starting in September, the super score is only going to be English, math, reading. Science will be there, but as a separate score.
another person's asking about specifically some study tools that they've probably seen advertised. And I've seen this one myself. I don't know if you're familiar with it, David, called Acely. It's an adaptive study tool, and they claim to offer more improvement because the questions are matched to the student's most needed area of improvement and level of difficulty.
So, well, I also don't want to get sued, but I don't want to like like throw mud on a company or get sued. What I will say is, Acely is not one of the two third-party providers that we use, and we've vetted every third-party provider that I know of.
Okay. Um, so how would just an average, I don't want to say we're all average, but like a parent who doesn't, this is not our specialty, and there is a lot of ads these days on Facebook of this test prep company, this, and these are tools now, and they're not necessarily like, working with individuals. Any suggestions about how parents should assess these companies?
The platforms are tough. I would try them out. I'd try it out. Try out, most of the like 1 month shouldn't be very expensive at all. I try out a month, have your kid, see if they like it, see if typically students know if they're acquiring more knowledge and skill. And so well, also the downside with platforms was the kid actually using the platform, right? So you might actually have to stay on top of that. But assuming the kid is actually using the platform, almost daily for like at least 15 minutes a day, did they do they really feel like they're learning and improving? If not, I'd go to a different platform. But it's hard to just say because a platform is very opaque. Whereas, maybe there's reviews of it, but like when you're talking about a tutoring company, you can usually talk to someone, look at reviews, read bios of people. Or I would say word of mouth. I mean, if you have friends and well, of course you have friends. Whoever asked that question, I'm sure you have friends. But hopefully you have friends of school age, talk to people in your community, see who do they use for prep, who's gotten good results. That's generally a pretty good way to get any referral. So
Somebody's asking if their student just focuses on math and science for the ACT. Is it possible to make improvements between now and June 14th? And I will kind of maybe add to that question. What is a good time frame that you know parents and students should kind of set aside if they want to see improvements in scores? Like they kind of need to plan backwards and say, okay, my student needs to have this amount, these number of months to really, just put in the effort to get the improvements that they want to see.
yes, so there's no shortcut. So I mean, some students will do it faster or slower, but ultimately you have to learn the knowledge and the skill. Again, maybe with the exception basically of Desmos, because Desmos is such a they have to weaken that tool. It's too powerful. But with the exception of Desmos, you would have to look at, okay, what's my score at? What score do I want to get to? Okay, like let's say you want to go up 5 points on the ACT. There's no way you're going to do that in a month. I mean, you could work like every single day on it, and you're a vanishingly small percentage of students will be able to go up 5 points in a month on the ACT. So how much can you realistically, let's say on the ACT, go up in a month if you're working hard on it? Maybe 3 points if you're working really, really hard on it. But yeah, one way or another, you got to learn the knowledge and skill.
Okay, but what about the other part of the question? Like, what if, I'm planning out next year for my upcoming junior? How
Yeah.
much time should I put aside that it would be a sufficient time for them to really, test prep and do as best that they could?
Yeah. So I hate to say like I need more context, but I would say seriously, you can reach out to us. And I do a lot of the phone calls myself. But it's all going to depend on what schools do you have in mind? Okay, the schools that you have in mind, that's going to set our score goal. Now, from our score goal, now we have the mock test. So we take the mock test. So now we have what's our initial starting score? What's our score goal? The delta between that determines how much test prep. So there are students who are one and done. You know, they like let's say you're starting at like a 33 on the ACT. Those kids miss so few questions that they don't need much prep and they might one and done the test with a 36 in September, right? And again, they didn't even need that much work because so much of it is just assigning it and going over the very few questions that they get wrong. Whereas if you're starting with a student who has a 20 on the ACT, so I literally have a student in mind who I'm thinking of, um, I'll use her initials, AP, right? So she started at a 20 in June of last year. Now she's at a 32 on the ACT. That's insane, right? But I've personally worked with her for 2 hours a week for, basically a year now, right? So it really depends on where you're starting, where you want to get to, what's the delta between.
Okay. Um, uh, what if, talk about the math level that's needed for each test. Like somebody is saying, I heard that I only need, or that my student needs 10th grade math to do the SAT, but they really need 11th grade math to do the ACT.
Right. So, for some students, they will do Algebra 2 trigonometry by the end of 10th grade, and then they only needed 10th grade, right? But the more typical route is that students learn Algebra 2 and or trig, at least the fundamentals of trig that they need for the test by the end of 11th grade. So it's the more typical track is by the end of 11th grade, you've learned all the math.
What about the PSAT? Has it become adaptive as well, like the SAT?
It has become adaptive. Yeah. So it's really just a slightly shorter, slightly easier SAT. I would still take it, right? I mean, even if you're not going to use the scores, it's more practice taking a standardized test. It's a long test, right? It's about 2 hours, and most students are not taking tests that are 2 hours. So if you're not doing 2 mile runs, I don't do 2 mile runs. I would get destroyed by a 2 mile run, right? But if I kept doing, 2 mile runs, it would become easier and easier. Same thing with test taking. So the more practice they have taking full-length standardized tests, the better they'll build that stamina of maintaining their focus over a long period of time.
Can you talk about, again, like test prep? Is what's the value of doing test prep in a group setting versus one-on-one?
Yeah, so definitely the group setting is more economical. Um, the limitation of it, especially it's the classroom setting is difficult if you're most of the time if you're on the very low end or the very high end of the scores because a classroom setting is built typically to teach the material that the average student needs to know, right? Just the foundational material that the average student needs to know. If you're far below that, it's probably going to go too fast for you. If you're high above that, you're probably going to be bored. Now, the benefit of the private tutoring is it's going to go at that student's pace and be very individualized. If anything was too fast, the student just says, "Hey, like that was too fast," and then the tutor will rephrase it. So, it's certainly more expensive. I would say there's no hidden knowledge, there's no hidden skills. Any student can get to the same score. It is a question, though, of how fast and does the student have their own motivation to do so. So you could do all self-studying and get to, the same score increases. Be a lot of self-studying. You could do a class in self-studying. Typically, the fastest way to accomplish it would be that private tutoring, though, because it's so individualized.
Another question about, can you gauge how much you might be able to help a student if they come and they tell you what they've done on a sample test and their grades? So basically, and we were actually talking about this before we got on, like if, how much can and I'm making it up and you can give other examples, can a student who has a 30, how much can they really improve versus, and is it the same or a different amount than a student that you're starting with at 25?
Right. So the student I have in mind, which actually I was talking about with you, Debbie, initials KC, so our color KC. So she started at 17. She's now at a 27. She's going for a 29. And I've been upfront with her dad that we're really hitting the point of diminishing returns at this point, right? And I will say though, if you had asked me, hey, David, like after my first session with her, David, what score do you think KC can get up to? I think I would have said like 24. It always surprises me, actually. No, not always. It usually surprises me just how high students can get. Because the thing that I don't anticipate, that is hard to anticipate, is how much will the student improve in skill. And so KC, when she was at a 17, I can teach her topics, but I cannot teach her the hard exponent questions. I can teach her the easy and medium exponent questions. Same thing with quadratic. I can never touch those hard questions with her. So I can teach her a lot of topics and I can see, okay, when I teach her these different topics, that's how much her score is going to improve by. What's harder to know in advance is how much will the student improve in skill. Well, now Casey is at the point where she's starting to be able to solve some of these hard math questions because she's better at math. She's literally more skillful. She has more aptitude in the math. And so that's really hard to anticipate in the beginning. That other student who went from 20 to 32, she's been like transformed as a student, right? So it wasn't just teaching her topics. We had to fundamentally improve her ability at reading and math. And that usually takes longer, but it's doable with enough work.
Right. That's why people, maybe you do or you don't understand. It's just the fundamental skills, however strong or not strong that student is in these fundamentals, makes, the test prep easier or hard.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Um, so kind of along this similar discussion, somebody is asking, at what age or grade level do you recommend students start taking the ACT, I guess, for practice and kind of like understanding what their baseline is?
Yeah, so our average student starts in June after sophomore year, whenever sophomore year ends. They do intensive prep over the summer. And our students, this is atypical, but our students tend to start taking the real tests in the fall of their junior year. So again, they're just going to take the September, October, December. They're just going to take those ACTs or SATs as practice until they hit their score goal. And one of the benefits to that is around this time of year, I'm rarely working on all the sections with a student because they've typically pretty much maxed out in on the ACT, at least in one or two of the sections, and on the SAT, they pretty typically maxed out on at least on one of the sections. So then we're just going for the super score most of the time at this point. So that's the benefit. You just keep taking the test, and it happens where you just have a really good day on the reading or the math that day, and now we've locked in that score. For most students, we're never going to work on those again. Now, some students have a college list where they get unlucky, and most of the schools on their list don't super score the ACT. Okay, then we have to go for the composite, and we have to keep practicing all the sections. But most students have a school list primarily comprised of schools that super score the ACT. So at this point, I mean, actually earlier today, I was meeting with student Nicholas. We're just working on ACT reading, right? I assign him 3 ACT reading sections every week, and that's the only homework he gets. He's going to crush it because that's all we're focusing on.
Great. Okay. Wow. Lot of good. I think we spent, which is fine, as much time on the questions as we did on your slides, David.
Nice.
So I think this is really valuable. My kids have already gone through this, but it was one thing that we kind of planned on, and kind of I hope people take away from this is you do have to plan. It's particularly if your kids want to do as well as they can. They can't turn around, and make improvements on a dime. So really kind of plan backwards and make sure that there is enough time for your student to prep and kind of improve their score the way they want to. And then also don't hit it up against, is my opinion, against the beginning of senior year, because there is the kind of like these phases to the process, and quite honestly, as soon as they're done kind of hitting whatever score they want to hit, then you got to move on to visiting colleges, creating a college list, and doing essays. So it's really a lot of pressure for your student to be working on essays and doing test prep at the same time. I mean, unfortunately, both probably won't do as well as they could have and should have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. One last quick question for people who aren't aware. Do you want to just explain what the super score is?
Yeah, good question. So it's those fundamental questions that sometimes I skip over.
Right.
I assume knowledge. So the super score would be, let's say a student, I'll use the ACT. Let's say a student hits a 34 on the English on one day. Well, for most of the students, we're just going to say, okay, that's as good as we're going to do on the English. So we'll never work on the English ever again. And maybe that English score drops to a 28. And so the next test, they get a 28. For the majority of colleges, it doesn't matter. That college is only going to see that 34. And I guess, I mean, it'll take just a second. I'll just share my screen and show what it actually looks like. So it's not theoretical. So this is just a dummy account for the Common App. So when students go in and report their scores, they self-report their scores. It's not unless they get accepted and enroll at the vast majority of schools that they actually send their official score reports from the testing agencies. So like for the ACT, let's say that student gets a 34 on one day, they've just locked that in. If they get a 29 the next day, they can't report it in the Common App. There's literally not, well, okay, that was the composite, sorry. The English, let's say they get a 34, the next time they get a 29, they can't report the 29. There's literally no place for them to even input it in the Common App. And this is what the vast majority of schools use. So then, again, let's say the student then on a different day gets a 33. Okay, for most students, stop working on it, just work on the other sections. So then in that way, they're only locking in their highest section score from any test date. Does that make sense? Or
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Okay. Well, David, thank you so much for
My
all
pleasure.
your knowledge. And I think everybody who was here tonight really appreciates it. And I'm sure people who watch it will as well. And hopefully the takeaway is plan, understand the difference between the ACT and SAT, really use reputable College Board or ACT created sample tests. And always reach out. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to David with any questions you have, and particularly how to move forward, helping your student get the score that they want to receive.
Perfect.
Okay. Good night, everyone. Thanks, David.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.